Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us the lead designer, the director of visual merchandising and head of content and creative strategy at Good Earth. She is also the founder and creative director of Pavitra Rajaram Design, an award-winning interior design firm. You know who she is. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on the stage our post-lunch speaker. Joining us right now, a huge round of applause, Ms. Pavitra Rajaram. Welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had lunch, we've got the energy. Let's put our hands together, really.
I have to say, as someone who always works behind the scenes, that kind of introduction makes me really nervous. Well, you know, I think what I'm going to share with you today is a little unusual. When I walked through the exhibition center, my feeling was that this was a world somewhat alien from some of the things I'm going to talk about today. And perhaps that's a good thing. So we can discuss the differences and the similarities perhaps in the questions and answers. So I want to start by sharing a little bit about my own personal journey as a designer, because that informs the work that we do. And I also want to talk about the context in which we design. And for me, product and visual merchandising, there isn't really a difference between the two things because they both focus on storytelling. The philosopher Carl Jung put forth the idea that the core of our unconscious carries collective memories that are common to us as humans. He articulated a concept of universal archetypes hardwired into our souls. He suggested that these universal patterns of human behavior are perennial themes representing our collective yearning, imagination, and deepest desires. They can be divine or diabolical, the sinner or the saint, the explorer, the conqueror, the hero, the loving mother, the wise sage, the destructive rebel, and so on. We are surrounded by archetypes in the recurrent symbols found in art, literature, movies, soaps, and of course, mythology. Our response to and our understanding of aesthetics and design is through this lens. For those in the audience who are not familiar, that's a visual of the Emperor Akbar, painted in the miniature style. That's a comic that tells the story of the Emperor Akbar. And the third is a still from a movie, from a Hindi film that talks about. So really our references come from across various visual media. We all carry an ancient racial memory that comes down through hundreds of generations and forms the core of our beliefs. It's especially important in our context since we belong to a civilization that is not just among the oldest in the world, but most importantly, is the only unbroken living civilization of this world. By this I mean that Vedic chants from the Rig Veda from over 3,000 years ago are still chanted daily in temples today. The Vishwanath temple in Banaras is an example of this tradition of chanting through such sounds that have come down through oral tradition from the time of the Rig Veda, so the precursor to language as we know it. Other ancient traditions extend to many cultural aspects, such as weaving, natural dye printing, also the making of clay vessels and folk iconography, where so many designs are made today, just as they were made thousands of years ago and with similar tools. Illustrating this aspect of inheriting ancient tradition is our belief of many lives and not just this one lifetime. We believe in karma and horoscopes, and most of us continue to have these beliefs even as we live very modern lifestyles. Perhaps the most wonderful thing is that although ours is an unbroken, continuous culture, it has nevertheless been constantly evolving, assimilating influences from across Asia and parts of Europe through interactions along the Silk Route and invasions that started with the Greeks from the time of Alexander 2,500 years ago. This eclectic culture is the common itihas that binds us as a people, and it is in this context that I would like to share my journey as a designer. Starting out 24 years ago in January, it was a lovely winter's day in Bombay, if you have a winter, we opened Good Earth in Kemp's Corner. My initial impulse when we did that was simply to just create beautiful things for everyday learning. Soon, however, we realized that in order to create meaningful objects of lasting value, I needed to articulate a design philosophy for myself to guide my work, and also our vision for the visual merchandising and storytelling of Good Earth. After some introspection and thought-provoking discussion with mentors like Good Earth's founder Anita Lal and the late Martin Singh, what I came to understand was the importance of creating products and visual stories for a lifestyle that is relevant in the Indian context. There is no English word that adequately describes what this importance means, but in Urdu it is ahmiyat. If you Google the word ahmiyat, as I did, the meaning that you will get is accent, attention, bearing, caliber, concern, concernment, consequence, denotation, distinction, drift, effect, emphasis, force, gist, gravity, import, influence, paramountcy, seriousness, signification, usefulness, preponderance, momentousness, so on and so forth. But let me explain in a less complicated way what I recognized. I started thinking about the world around me and saw that color was what defined it. Colorful saris and turbans, colorful flowers, colorful spices, and yet Indian homes in the mid-90s had forsaken color, and we had bland crockery, and beige and brown were the most popular shades in a home. I did notice that many of the displays when I came were either black or white. It did strike me as somewhat ironic as I walked through. I suppose some of this is the residual influence of the English and their love of pastels, and also there was a new universal trend of neutral tones with Scandinavian aesthetics being seen as in. But the point was that what works in the cold light of Scandinavia and England does not have ahmiyat in an Indian home. So how could I add ahmiyat to my work? One natural impulse was love of nature, as the very name Good Earth implies. Van Vaibhav is an important concept in Indian aesthetics. It means the splendor of the forest. There are innumerable shlokas celebrating the splendor of the sun, the moon, the stars, birds, animal, and the forest. We humans are a part of this splendor and are lost when we move away from it. So almost all my visual stories are based on bringing some element of nature into our lives, be it in the actual form of birds, trees, flowers, or just the colors of nature, both vibrant and earthy, or the scents and oils of real flowers, resins, and grasses from the earth. We stay close to nature at Good Earth. In India, we understand color by how it appears in nature. Jamun, Neel, Falsa, Keri, Asmani, Geru, Mayur, Pyazi, Gulabi, and so on. These colors evoke very specific emotions based on our own experience of this element. I grew up in the south of India, in Chennai, and there is a very particular color. It's a sort of a teal, a blue-green, an iridescent color. In Tamil, it's called Mail Kaithu. That's the neck of the peacock. How do you explain a color like that through Pantone shade? It is culture that gives context to our stories and our language. Apart from relevance, another aspect of ahmiyat is value. At Good Earth and in my practice, I consciously stay away from the Western style of consumption, of buying and selling huge quantities of items that are inexpensive and easily discarded and replaced next season. So, whether it is for the clothes that I design, or the textiles and tableware for home, or the spaces I create, or the ideas that I try to depict through visual merchandising, my endeavor is to create products and places and ideas that elevate the experience of owning them or living in them. The quality of design has to be thoughtful, and products and spaces mindfully made, thereby rejecting the idea of fads and what is in fashion or out. The essence of culture for us as Indians is that it is both timeless and of the moment. That is why the designs that resonate are those that are timeless and current at the same time, and they always evoke some positive emotion based in our own ancestral memory. This brings up an important aspect of Indian aesthetics, and that is the concept of rasa. In Sanskrit, rasa literally means the essence within a work of art that evokes a sublime emotion in the receiver. This feeling cannot be described and exists only if the work is capable of evoking it. Without the bhava of rasa, a work is sterile and mechanical. I see value in creating visual stories that say something to the viewer and that enhance some aspect of living. Designs that can be accumulated and that sit well with each other and continue to be enjoyed over a long period of time. When you live with something over time and get attached to it, it has an emotional connect, and this is where its value lies, in enhancing your experience of owning and using it. And that's perhaps what Mary Kondo is saying when she says, "Does this bring you joy?" The moment you start to evaluate your work as a designer in terms of its ahmiyat, you're able to transcend conventional boundaries or silos and eschew these labels of graphic designer, product designer, interior designer, exhibit designer. For me personally, this has been hugely freeing, and I've dipped back and forth between all of these. It's really like knowing a language and therefore being able to write prose, poetry, dialogue, and headlines. Each one has a variable syntax, but being rooted in the language allows clear expression across each style. In fact, in my own journey, the exploration of different areas of design through this lens has helped me forge an organic and eclectic and unique language of my own. Somewhere along the way, in order to bring more relevance to my work, I began to engage intensively with crafts and craftspeople, and therein began a journey that's taken me to places as far-flung as Kashmir, Telangana, Bhuj, and Orissa to work in crafts as diverse as papier-mâché, kalamkari, ajrak, and ikkat. How unfortunate that none of the visual merchandising that we see around us incorporates or borrows from any of these timeless traditions. In the past year, I have crossed over to yet another area, and that is experience design for a museum archive called Sarmaya. The challenge here is to explore new ways of sharing visual stories since there is no physical museum. So on one hand, we design experiences in the digital space, and on the other, we design real-time experiences like travel and performance art, which happens to be how all folk art was experienced in our culture anyway, because paintings were never made to hang on walls. Rather, they were living, breathing shrines and were displayed accompanied by ritual music, theater, and dance. At this point, I would like to touch upon perhaps what is, I think, the most important facet of the design process for visual merchandising, and that is the need for cohesive and rooted storytelling. As an oral culture, we are used to taking in a multiplicity of narratives to understand a story. Music, theater, dance, costume, puppetry, colors all play a part in how we understand things. For example, the sound of the temple bell at sunset evokes a particular memory. The azan at dawn, yet another. A Kathakali mask tells one story, a Tolu Bomalata puppet, something else. Emerald green with a crescent moon means one thing. Indigo blue with a full moon evokes something completely different. So when we tell visual stories, the starting point has to be rooted in a story that is both familiar and new. And the final leap comes when the designer's story, coming out of their own experience, is felt by the viewer who uses their own imagination to complete the picture. This is the collaboration or jugalbandi inherent in the completion of the visual merchandising process, and that is how storytelling adds value and relevance to it. I would now like to show you some specific examples of my work and share some specific stories that inspired them as a way of illustrating this point. This is a dinner collection created for Good Earth and styled by me. It's called Sarai. The inspiration for this was the love story of the Emperor Jahangir and his 20th wife, the Empress Noor Jahan. They crossed the Pir Panjal mountains from dusty Delhi to the wonderful summers in Kashmir 14 times. And this idea came out of the imagination of what would have greeted them along that journey. Beautiful, blooming, fragrant roses, gardens verdant and with leaping deer and peacocks, tents that were set up for sumptuous dining, richness of color, sensuality of experience. So this design really was rooted in that story. And when I see some of you smiling when I tell the story and you look at the design, it underscores the point that I'm trying to make, which is that culture and the stories we know and have absorbed over the years are what give value to the objects that we begin to appreciate. This is just a close-up of some of the designs. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go a little faster. This was inspired by the palaces, but it was created for glass, so using a contemporary medium, but telling a rooted story. So this is a story I'd like to share. There was an exhibition in January at the CSMVS Museum. I'm not sure how many people are based in Bombay and caught it. It was called India and the World, and it was a show that borrowed from museums across the world. And this was a kalamkari textile, a trade textile created in the 16th century that spoke of the trade that occurred in the Sindh area, an area that we know as the Northwest Frontier Province, but even before that, in our culture, was called Gandhara. This is how I interpreted the idea of Gandhara for a visual story for Good Earth. And the styling of this was to bring this idea that a sense of spareness, a sense of austerity, a sense of rhythm and order. So the product lends itself to its visual depiction, but the visual depiction itself comes from a story in a way that we've learned and assimilated over the years. This is Gandhara. It took root in a textile, in a museum textile, but then it found its way to the shelves in this fashion. So this is something for, the original is of course in the Met in New York. I met someone here who was from the US, and I'm sure there are lots of other people here. There's a company called Motahede that does reproductions of old bone china patterns. This is a famous pattern called the tobacco leaf. For those of you who know the story, ceramics were produced in China, and huge ships carrying this cargo went all the way from China through the Indian Ocean, the Cape of Good Hope, up into Europe for consumption by the West. And these ships would often run into storms, hit rocks, and sometimes sink. So I started to think of what if this sank somewhere near the coast of Kerala on one of these trips. And if it emerged and then we had a chance to make it ours, what would it look like? And that's what I created. It's a design that I call Serendip, or the serendipity of found objects. And I imagine that you would find it rising from the bottom of the ocean, and that is the root of this idea. Just a few more visuals. I'm a bit nervous about time. So this is the inside of the Good Earth flagship store. For those of you who haven't seen it, come by and take a look. It's a 12,000 square foot space in Bombay in an old mill, and one would like to think that it was a game changer. And why I say it's a game changer and what I take as the greatest endorsement of my work, we open for the season every year on the first day of Navratras, so it's August or September. And when I drive down Marine Drive in late November and early December, every wedding mandap that I see looks like this. So for me, that's the greatest compliment and the endorsement of the visual merchandising stories that we tell, if someone wants to then take that and make that their own. This was the sacred grove, Van Vaibhav, and when you entered the space, all you heard was the sound of birds and bees and water in the forest. This was the most Instagrammed image of 2018 in retail in India. There are so many more, and I could go on and on. In the same story, this was another garden that we created. We called it the Pichwai Garden, or the garden inspired by the paintings of Nathdwara. One would imagine Krishna and Radha frolicking on these swings to these beautiful chandeliers. So the differentiation between what is product and what is visual merchandising, what is inspiration and what is consumption, those are the lines that we try to blur in our storytelling. This is another story from a time when we did a collection on Benares, the ancient town of Benares, and we recreated with 21st century Siporex bricks the feeling of the ghats in Benares. One thing that I do want to point out, not that I'm averse to technology, is that some of the most powerful and poignant and emotive stories come from the use of simple, age-old materials and how one can be creative. Telling simple stories is often, in my opinion, more effective. These were visuals that we created on the walls. I imagine that in Benares, if one were in the Ganga, one would want wishes and blessings from the gods to be showered. So we created these beautiful flying swans, and they showered strings of jasmine on all the customers who walked into the store for that season. This was a collection inspired by Samarkand and Bukhara and our journey through Uzbekistan, which is a big part of our cultural heritage. That's where Babur came from, for those who didn't know. And Babur was actually a gardener and who claimed descent from both Genghis Khan, from the Mongols, and also from the Turks. So that is our connection to Persian, Turkish, and Mongol ancestry. And these are thermocol, but inspired by the domes of Samarkand. This image on the left, it was a freezing night in Samarkand. I come from the south of India. I feel very cold even in Bombay. And I had to drink a lot of vodka to stay warm. And it was a moonlit night filled with stars. And when I came back, that's how I interpreted it within the Good Earth store. On the right-hand side is our version of the cherry blossom trees that we saw in springtime in Uzbekistan. It's again resin and paper and cloth flowers. But the idea is that the visual merchandising stories we tell are inspired by the culture we experience and live. This is the mansion of Chettinad. It's an old Chettinad mansion with its tiles. And this is how I interpreted it in a courtyard in Alibag. I wanted to give the impression of something found over time. And so I scattered these tiles randomly through this courtyard, which is open to sky. This is a famous miniature by the artist Mansoor, painted in the 16th century for the Emperor Jahangir. He was presented a zebra by an Italian ambassador to his court. He believed it was fraudulent, so he ordered his court to wash the zebra relentlessly so that the painted stripes would come out. And of course, lo and behold, he discovered that there was such a thing as a striped mule. I interpreted it in a washroom, literally a bathroom, and the stripes and the story of Mansoor and Jahangir's zebra find a contemporary resonance in a contemporary home. This is the Shekhawati Havelis of Rajasthan. Many of you would be familiar with this. And this is how we interpreted it at a wallpaper salon at Good Earth, where we use strips of wallpaper to create the experience of a central courtyard. And this is actually within the Good Earth store. So finally, I'd just like to say that culture is cumulative with layers added over centuries. And at the risk of being controversial, I would say there is no such thing as a completely original idea. What is original and unique is one's own perspective and experience of the aesthetics, art, and stories that have gone before. As a designer, I see myself as part of this continuum, just adding something to what has gone before and making it more relevant and joyful in the contemporary context. Thank you very much.
We'd like to say thank you very much, ma'am. And we've got time for a couple of questions. So please raise your hand. Yes, we've got our first question. Can we have a mic brought on over to the second table in the corner?
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
First of all, I would like to really thank you because you brought in a point which is we tend to think that we're thinking, but we don't really think, which is feeling, which begin with the very fact that the moment you walk down the place here, you felt that something is really missing, you know? And I think the power to feel and express that in your work is something which is take away from this session, which is really beautiful.
Thank you.
My biggest question here is also that when someone explains the story behind a particular artifact, it sounds more intriguing, okay? So there are two ways of consuming it. One is that I go there and something evokes in me and I see it. And the second thing is someone is giving a story behind the entire thing and as a buyer, I get more intrigued. So how do you go about explaining that particular thing in the store in terms of building more on the business or, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think
because it's a little bit challenging thing and it's very difficult to explain. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know what you mean, so I'll attempt to answer that. I think the fact actually lies in how we experience culture. And there is a difference between West and East. It's not superior or inferior, it's just different. The West experiences the world in a very linear way. So their ways of learning and their ways of understanding go from A to B to C to D in a linear progression. Our culture, many Asian and African cultures, don't work like that. We are oral cultures. We experience things on various levels of engagement. So this idea of a painting being something that's hung on a wall, that's a Western idea. In the Indian context, a painting was a starting point for a performance, for worship, for a conversation. It was a backdrop to everyday living. It had utility, this idea of form and function. So how do we interpret that in the contemporary context? I think it becomes really, really important to embed visual clues rather than tell a story. So show, don't tell. So when I come to it and when I see something, you might embed 20 visual clues and I might pick up on 5. But if those 5 clues evoke something authentic in me, then as a visual merchandiser, you've done the job. So I cannot, as a South Indian, for example, I've never really visited the northeast of India. So I may not really understand something that's presented in the Naga context, but I understand rhythm. I understand heat. I understand primordial color. So if we put in layers into our work and try to show rather than using words, I think we evoke a much more intrinsic connection with buyers. And that's what really leads to sales. At Good Earth, we always say, we don't sell a product, we sell an idea. So I don't want to sell you a dinner plate, I want to sell you the table. You know, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I
but
think it's a lot about unsaid.
yes.
Yeah.
It is about the unsaid, but it's also about having the framework and the thinking and the background to embed those clues thoughtfully. It is about thoughtful visual presentation. Today, what happens is you see something visually, and not to generalize, but sometimes young designers particularly don't really have an answer as to why they put something in or why they left something out. You know, it's often a prototype that's come from a corporate brand where someone in an office sitting somewhere has decided how a particular space should look. Why should all makeup shops look the same? Why should Maybelline look the same all over India? For in the south of India, people are much darker skinned. In Punjab, people are much fairer skinned. Where are we allowing cultural variance in our design? Why are we subscribing to this idea that there is a one-stop, one-size-fits-all solution for this amazing country we live in? So it's so not true.
Thank you so much.